Good afternoon. I second Bree's comments about being comfortable and warming up and getting some delicious food. I have to say, I am such a fan of the Habitat model. And I also have to say, I am fortunate enough to work with a lot of Habitat affiliates across the state talking about fair housing and how they can put forward equitable housing opportunity. But I always refer to you guys in your model. I get to brag about you guys and the work that we've done together to think about equity in a meaningful way in this incredible program. So I'm a huge fan. So I have to say that. And I wanted to start just with a quote that really stood out to me from Dr. King's last speech on April 3rd down in Memphis. If anybody's interested, I'll give you my card or contact the Fair Housing Center. I'll send you the script of that speech. It is really a powerful gem filled with some moving, incredible statements that feel like they apply today more so, if not as much. So one of the things that inspired our artwork for this big moment in our Fair Housing Center is this quote here: "But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars." And I remind myself of that because I'll share some information about how difficult our work is, but also some of the successes before I turn the podium over to Dr. Johnson. I'm very eager to hear from him, so I'm going to move quickly. But if I go too fast, let me know to slow down. So the Fair Housing Center is a nonprofit. We are not an enforcement agency. We are not a governmental body. We're a nonprofit just like Habitat. And we really seek to prevent housing discrimination from occurring. What you'll hear a little bit more about from me today is the cost of housing discrimination and the negative effects of it, not just on the individual that experiences discrimination, but on our community. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the history and share some images and mapping about how our conversation about housing has gone and not gone well in some ways. I also want to highlight the Fair Housing Center is on the corner of Hall and Division. So we're right in the neighborhood, so you can come visit us. We are neighbors. In case you're not familiar with fair housing, I want to highlight that for me, housing choice is critical. People are having a hard enough time, and you guys know this. That's why you're called to do the work you're doing at the affiliate. It's hard enough to find housing that's affordable, good quality, in the neighborhood that you want to be in right now in West Michigan. We made another top 10 list last night. I can't even remember what it was. There's a lot of investment, speculation, interest in our community, which is great, but we're leaving people out, and people are being pushed and pulled, and they're having trouble finding housing. And when housing discrimination occurs on top of that, it makes a tough process that much harder. So it's all about protected classes and what's specifically listed in the law. So when we talk about who's affected and who we're housing, that's typically a fair housing issue. And the way our communities have developed right now, where we live dictates how we live. If you think back to the different communities or cities or states that you've lived in, you may realize, wow, where I was living really dictated the access that I had, the quality of life that I had, the opportunities that I had. So the laws cover a great variety, but not everyone. This is the list of federally protected classes. So everywhere in the country, it's illegal to discriminate in housing against people because of their religion, whether or not they have a physical or mental disability, whether or not they have children under the age of 18 in their household, their race, their skin color, where they are from, their national origin. We have a bigger umbrella here in Michigan, which I'm proud of. This is an important step in our civil rights history. In the 70s, Michigan passed a law that said we're going to add marital status and age to that list. So there are 9 protected classes. And then local communities can choose to do more. Grand Rapids has added sexual orientation and source of income, for example. So the laws can vary, which is good if they cover your community, but if you're living in a community that doesn't have that protected class that applies to you when you need it, it's a gap. This is a very powerful quote that I really strongly believe in, and especially with the conversations that we're having nationally today, I think there's a better understanding of how, bluntly put, some neighborhoods are likely to kill you. And you might think of crime and violence right away, but we're also able to tell you based on your zip code what your dental health looks like now, right? And your life expectancy. So there's a greater understanding of where we grow up, literally impacting the outcomes of our lives. So it's an exciting time to better understand that. And it's a great national conversation, but we need to act a little bit faster because we're losing too many people, and it's such a negative impact on our region that doesn't get fully understood and communicated. So it's jobs, it's education, it's having that quality housing, it's a safe neighborhood, can you get health care? All of these things are connected to where we live. So I'm going to simplify this quote with saying housing is the middle, right? And for us, equal housing is the middle of how we access all of those important things. Transportation, public transportation is a huge issue, right? So I hope you can see the different colors here. This is our case breakdown for last year. I just wanted to highlight very quickly a couple things. Thank you. We had 62 disability-related cases filed with us last year across West Michigan, followed by 52 race-based cases and 39 families with children feeling like they were experiencing housing discrimination. We also had a huge uptick in national origin-based cases. Typically, we would have 2 or 3, maybe 4 at most of those cases, and that number went up to 18. And I'll tell you, it went up in about 6 months. Okay. So, and I wanted to look back, given the nature of the conversation today, 2004 to 2017, the red line is the number of race-based cases we've received, and the blue line is national origin. So you can see that we're in an uptick right now of those types of discrimination becoming more common. I don't think they ever went away. I think what's happening now is they're more overt, they're more obvious. So how did we get here? We have a long history, and we have a history expert who I will defer a lot to, but there's a few things that our government did and our communities did that really put us in a place where we allowed the removal of opportunity and resources from people specifically related to housing. This is an example of what they call a restrictive covenant from Seattle in the 30s. These were very common. Many communities actually still have them, and they're still on the books. And I'll tell you, I've had a real estate agent at least once or twice a year tell me that they've been asked to enforce a racial restriction now. They've been outlawed for decades, but people still try to use them. And we're talking about not allowing anyone who's not of the white or Caucasian race, unless they're actually a domestic servant actually employed on the property. Then they're allowed to visit but not live there. So these are part of bylaws, homeowners associations, entire community developments that said this community is for this population only. And they got more restrictive. So here's DC, also from the 30s. We're talking about restricting people of Negro blood, the Semitic race, Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, or Syrians. How topical. Okay. This was part of our valuing of our communities, of how credit was made available. The Federal Housing Administration specifically talked about keeping people apart in their underwriting manual. So this was a manual given to professionals and said, this is how you have to do your job. You're going to be penalized if you don't comply with noting where we have incompatible racial and social groups living together. Any changes in that type of occupancy leads to instability. That's not true. We know diverse communities are stronger communities. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation went through and mapped more than 200 communities in our country, and this is where the term redlining comes from. Some of you will be a little bit more familiar with that. But one of the key things that they were doing was talking about how we're going to extend credit in our country when we started getting a little more loose with offering credit. And they were taking into account who? People. As I mentioned, that's very commonly going to be a fair housing issue. So these maps, these redlining maps, didn't necessarily create residential housing discrimination. That was already occurring on a number of levels, but it certainly reflected and then institutionalized practices that had been already started. And if you're interested in this, just Google Grand Rapids HOLC Maps, or again, contact me. You can spend a whole afternoon on this website pulling up this information. But this is the Grand Rapids map. It's actually more of a pink color, but it got a D. Everybody in school knows what a D is, right? That's a failing grade. A was green, B is blue, and C, passable but not great, yellow. So I wanted to look very quickly at a couple of the communities and talk about how these maps have shaped our communities today. So as I mentioned, we're a neighbor. So we're right outside of redlined areas down the way. And here we are today. We weren't mapped specifically in this neighborhood, which is a gap in and of itself. They weren't considering it for the conversation about credit. But you can see that we have yellow, red, 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 yellow surrounding this office. And then you can pull up profiles. They wrote a profile page for each of those subsections, and they were talking about what's favorable, what's positive. Well, these are city facilities, it's close to industry, the Division Avenue business corridor. Detrimental, it's older and it's obsolescence, and then the type of inhabitants is clearly noted. So they're looking at, you know, income, where they're working, what the trend of desirability is. So they're kind of forecasting what's about to happen. When they say it's going down, they made sure it went down. They're noting infiltration of Italians and Negroes, relief families or public assistance, they're present. You know, and they're actually talking about, you know, setting aside a group. They said there was a few percentage of Negroes present. That's the historical language. Coit was the yellow, Coit Park was the yellow section close by. And they're talking about small section lying on top of a hill. This is an amazing view, best kept secret in the city, right, up here. Gosh, a good modern school has been closed for lack of pupils. I wonder why that happened. They're contributing to that. Grandville, again, we've got trending down, mixed laboring occupants, 7% foreign-born. Holland has a presence, and again, more Negroes. But then we get into these clarifying remarks. This isn't a slum area. The Kelvinator plant makes it desirable. It's convenient for railroad employees. It almost rates a C, but we gave it a D anyway. So really damaging those families that were kind of spotted throughout this neighborhood. I was at Baxter recently. They were redlined. Some of the comments there, they were talking again about age and obsolescence. The type of dwelling and inhabitants were going down. They're noting that there is a Negro presence, a relief family presence. This is a clarifying remark. Negroes in the area are of better type. They are concentrated on Sherman, Bates, and Thomas, so they know exactly where folks are. Question, sure.
That question, you know, Negro Pride, is this like an old?
This was done in the 1930s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So older language, right?
Okay.
Yep. Doesn't make it appropriate, but older.
Right.
Like give it a historical context. So here we are, you know, I was at Hope Church talking to them recently. Oh, here we are, yellow, it's static to up. Okay, again, still the same type of workers, roughly the same income, but we've got a Dutch percentage present. No relief families, it's a growing neighborhood. As I said, you could spend all day looking at all of these neighborhoods. But here we have a couple of comments about infiltration of people with lower living standards. I shared the slum piece. So we just, we codified and documented and created a system related to who was living where, and that really impacted our community then, but also now. So I'm going to flip back and forth. So kind of get the curve of the river in your eye, if you would. Look at where the red and yellow spaces are. This is a racial dot map of 2010 census data. So blue dots are whites, green dots are blacks, red dots are Asians, and orange dots are Hispanic. So I'm going to flip back and forth there. Keep an eye on the river to orient yourself. So the communities that had the rug cut out from under them in terms of investment and allowing for investment, there's a familiarity to that pattern, right? So we're talking about decades, but the influence is very strong. So if you're interested, this is Cooper Center demographic dot mapping. The whole country is dot mapped. Again, you could spend a whole afternoon really examining communities, and it really changes the framework of how I think about how we got where we are too. We haven't gotten very far from mapping. Anybody remember this making the rounds on social media? Where we're talking about, hey, this is where the really rich people live, this is where the hipsters are, this is charmingly shady. My neighborhood where I spend a lot of time working and trying to make sure that we have equitable housing opportunity is simply labeled crime. Confederate flags and pickups, farms, irrelevant until M6 was built, trailer parks, beyond. We haven't gotten very, very far away from that kind of labeling, have we? So I want to turn over the conversation to Dr. Johnson, but I just encourage you to think about these issues. If you're interested in learning more or having us come speak, find us. You've got contact information under your seats about what fair housing is. We've got events going on, book clubs. We're willing to come into classrooms, talk to any group that is interested in fair housing. Whether you're a housing professional or looking to move anytime soon, it's good for you to know your fair housing rights.